He came home a hero, and it nearly destroyed him. The second man to ever set foot on another world stood on a stage in front of the entire planet, waved to cheering crowds in more than 20 countries, and shook hands with kings and presidents, and inside, he was quietly falling apart. Nobody in that ticker-tape parade could have guessed it. Nobody watching him plant a flag on gray lunar dust could have imagined that within a year he would be sitting alone in the dark, unable to get out of bed, drinking to silence a grief he couldn't even name. This isn't a story about a giant leap. This is a story about what happens after the leap, when the cameras turn off and a man is left standing in the wreckage of his own triumph, trying to figure out who he is now that he has already done the most extraordinary thing a human being can do. Because the truth about that moment in 1969 is far stranger, far more human, and far more haunting than the postcard version we were all taught in school. To understand what happened to Buzz Aldrin, you first have to understand the man before the moon. He was born Edwin Eugene Aldrin Jr. in Montclair, New Jersey, in 1930, the son of a career military aviator who had once trained under Orville Wright himself, and who carried enormous, sometimes suffocating expectations for his only son. Buzz, a nickname his younger sister gave him as a toddler when she mispronounced the word brother, grew up under the shadow of a father who measured achievement obsessively and rarely offered warmth in return. He excelled anyway. He graduated third in his class from West Point, flew 66 combat missions as a fighter pilot during the Korean War, and later earned a doctorate in astronautics from MIT, where his research on orbital rendezvous techniques would later become genuinely useful to the space program he was about to join. On paper, he was exactly what NASA wanted. Brilliant, disciplined, technically gifted almost beyond comparison. Off paper, he was carrying something heavier than any flight suit. Depression ran through his family like a fault line beneath a house. His mother, whose maiden name was, almost unbelievably, Marion Moon, had a father who died by suicide. Buzz's own mother would later take her own life as well, just months before Apollo 11 launched, a fact the family kept quiet from the public for years. He carried that grief onto the launch pad and never spoke of it during the mission itself, because there was no room for grief in a countdown. The mission itself unfolded exactly as history remembers it. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V rocket lifted Aldrin Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins away from Kennedy Space Center and toward the moon. 4 days later, the lunar module Eagle separated from the command ship and descended toward the Sea of Tranquility, guided by Armstrong's steady hands through the final terrifying seconds when the computer began flashing program alarms and the fuel gauge crept toward empty. When the engine finally cut and the pad settled onto lunar soil, Aldrin's own voice crackled back to mission control with a simple, almost mundane phrase: "Contact light, engine stop." Hours later, Armstrong climbed down the ladder first and spoke the words that would be repeated for the rest of human history. 19 minutes after that, Aldrin followed him down, becoming the second human being ever to stand on another world. And it was Aldrin, not Armstrong, who first looked around at that alien landscape and searched for language equal to what he was seeing. What came out of him were 2 words that would end up defining the rest of his life, far more than any of the mission's official milestones: magnificent desolation. He meant it literally, describing a horizon that curved away too closely, a sky that stayed pitch black even at midday, a silence with no atmosphere to carry sound, a place of overwhelming beauty and absolute emptiness existing in the same breath. He did not yet know that he had just described, without realizing it, the exact shape of what was waiting for him back on Earth. The world Aldrin returned to was not built to receive a man in crisis. It was built to receive a legend. He, Armstrong, and Collins were flown on a 45-day tour across the globe, greeted by staggering crowds in city after city, showered with honors from more than 20 nations, treated everywhere as living myths rather than as men. For a while, the adrenaline and spectacle of it all carried Aldrin along. But spectacle is not the same thing as purpose. And when the tour ended and the parade stopped and the crowds went home, Aldrin found himself facing a question that no amount of training had prepared him for. What do you do with the rest of your life after you have already done the single most famous thing a human being has ever done? He had spent almost 2 decades climbing an impossibly steep ladder, from West Point to fighter combat, to a doctorate, to the astronaut corps, to the surface of another world. And now the ladder simply ended. There was nothing above the top rung. He later wrote that he found himself with an empty feeling that nothing seemed to fill, no matter where he looked or what new project he tried to throw himself into. He joined corporate boards. He gave speeches. He tried to organize public forums on the future of space travel. None of it touched the hollow place the mission had left behind. By the early 1970s, the man who had once kept his composure through a computer alarm during the most dangerous 90 seconds of powered descent in human history could not get through an ordinary public appearance without his hands shaking uncontrollably. He described one incident from that period in his own memoir, recalling how during a routine speaking engagement his composure simply broke. Apart mid-interview, how he retreated afterward to a quiet alley and wept until he could compose himself enough to be led away by his wife. He began drinking more heavily, sometimes not bothering to get out of bed for entire days. His marriage, already strained, began to crumble under the weight of what he was going through. In 1971, he was hospitalized for clinical depression, an almost unthinkable admission for a decorated military officer and a national icon in an era when mental illness was treated as either weakness or shame, something men in uniform simply did not discuss with each other, let alone announce to the public. Aldrin did both. He went public with his diagnosis in the years that followed, becoming one of the very first prominent American men to speak openly about depression and later about his struggle with alcoholism, at a moment in history when doing so could easily have ended what remained of his career and reputation. It very nearly did. His marriage ended in divorce. 2 more marriages would follow and eventually end as well. For years he moved in and out of treatment programs, relapsing, recovering, relapsing again, chasing some version of stability that always seemed to slip away just as he reached for it. What makes this part of the story so striking is not simply that a famous astronaut struggled with depression. Plenty of extraordinary people have. What makes it striking is the specific shape of Aldrin's crisis, because it was inseparable from the very experience that made him famous. He had traveled farther from Earth, seen more of the universe with his own eyes, and touched a more profound silence than almost anyone in the history of the species. And what he brought back from that silence was not simply wonder. It was a confrontation with scale that very few human minds are built to absorb without consequence. Standing on that gray plain, looking up at a black sky in the middle of what should have been daylight, watching the Earth hang small and blue and fragile above a horizon that curved away far too quickly, Aldrin experienced something astronauts have since come to call the overview effect, a profound psychological shift that occurs when a human being sees the whole of their planet from a great enough distance to grasp, viscerally rather than intellectually, just how small and precious and alone it truly is. For some astronauts, that experience produces a kind of spiritual peace. For Aldrin, arriving already carrying inherited grief and a lifetime of relentless perfectionism, it seems instead to have cracked something open that had been under pressure for years, and there was no ladder left to climb that could put the pieces back the way they had been. He has spoken about this many times since, in interviews spanning decades, always in his own precise, careful language, never with the manufactured drama that so much modern retelling likes to attach to his name. During the mission's 50th anniversary, when reporters asked which single moment from Apollo 11 stayed with him most vividly, he did not point to Armstrong's first step, or the flag, or the instant of touchdown. He pointed instead to the silence, the complete absence of sound in a place with no atmosphere to carry it, a stillness so total it felt less like peace than like standing at the very edge of something incomprehensibly large. That is, in a very real sense, the truth behind the idea that the moon is not what most people think. It is not simply a triumphant postcard, a flag and a footprint, and a line of dialogue memorized in grade school. For the man who walked there, it was an experience so vast that his own mind needed years, therapy, honesty, and enormous courage to fully process it. And even then, the reckoning never entirely ended. What ultimately saved him was not a mission control team or a training manual, but something far more ordinary. sustained sobriety, professional treatment, and an increasingly public willingness to talk about what he had been through rather than hide it. Aldrin has said in later interviews that alcohol itself was never really the core problem, only a symptom of a much deeper struggle with grief, identity, and the terrifying question of what a person does with themselves once they have already achieved what once seemed like the outer limit of human ambition. By the 1990s, he had found more stable footing, in part through advocacy work, becoming a visible and credible voice on mental health at a time when few public figures of his stature were willing to say the words depression or alcoholism about themselves in front of a camera. He has spent the decade since not running from the story of his collapse, but folding it into the larger story of who he is, a man who reached the most impossible physical destination in human history, and then discovered that the harder journey, the one nobody trains you for, was finding a way to live an ordinary life afterward. There's something almost unbearably poignant in the fact that the same two words Aldrin used to describe the lunar surface, magnificent and desolate, turned out to describe his own inner world in the years that followed just as precisely. He did not invent a grand secret about the moon that the public was never told. He simply lived, in full public view eventually, the genuine ND devastating aftermath of an experience so far outside normal human scale that it broke him before it healed him. That is the real story hiding behind the headline. Not a hidden truth about the lunar surface itself, not some withheld revelation about what he supposedly saw or felt while standing in the Sea of Tranquility, but the far more human truth that walking on another world does not exempt a person from grief, or from the crushing question of what comes next, or from the long, unglamorous work of putting a shattered life back together one sober day at a time. Buzz Aldrin's tears, the very real ones documented across decades of interviews, memoirs, and public confessions, were never about some conspiracy the moon was hiding from the rest of us. They were about the price of being human enough to feel the full weight of the extraordinary thing he had done, and brave enough, years later, to admit exactly how much it had cost him. So when people say the moon is not what you think, perhaps the truest version of that sentence has nothing to do with the moon at all. It has to do with the man who stood on it. Buzz Aldrin gave the world a phrase, magnificent desolation, meaning to describe a landscape, and ended up, without realizing it in that moment, writing the epitaph for the years of his own life that would follow. What do you think it would take to stand on another world and come home whole? Tell me in the comments what you believe you would have felt, standing in that silence, looking back at a small blue earth hanging alone in the dark.